Minister, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank the organizers for the very kind invitation to this timely event. As the Minister so forcefully reminded us, climate change is really an existential challenge for humankind. I cannot, of course, address all aspects of climate change. I thought I would focus on one aspect of this enormous challenge, which is the role of institutional investors. What role can they play, and how do we see the perspectives on the relationship between investors and the corporate sector in the area of climate change? As was mentioned in the introduction, the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, is a global organization for financial institutions focusing on responsible investment practices. We are affiliated with the United Nations, established 12 years ago. We now have 2,000 signatories in 50 countries, a little over 60 of these signatories here in Japan. The role of the PRI is to bring together investors to learn more about how to implement responsible investment practices, how to integrate environmental, social, governance factors in investing, to learn from each other, but also to study policy issues that are relevant for the development of responsible investing. Every year, we ask our signatories what they think we should focus on in the coming year. What kind of issues do they think, as investors, are most important for them, for the PRI to focus on, and where we could provide support for their work? This year, and last year, and the year before that, the number one issue for institutional investors was climate change. I think the investment industry is quickly realizing that the issue of climate change represents both risks and opportunities to investors. And understanding how to address these risks and how to exploit these opportunities is central to institutional investors. I'll remind you that institutional investors very often have very long time horizons for their investment activities. A pension fund will typically start receiving payments on a policy when a person starts working, maybe in his or her early or mid-20s. That person will contribute to the pension plan while he or she is working and receive a pension normally, in many cases, for the rest of their lives. So the time span from the first payment into the plan till the last payment out of the plan can be measured in decades, 50, 60, even 70 years. It's becoming increasingly obvious to asset owners that climate change and climate policies represent factors that can represent material impact on risk and return on a financial portfolio over that kind of long time horizon. So this is a useful time, I think, to reflect on the role of institutional investors in addressing this issue. And I think it's a very good and useful starting point to reflect a little bit on the role of the financial industry more in general. In a market economy, the role of financial institutions is to determine which companies get financing and which companies do not get financing. Banks decide if companies get loans. Investors decide whether they will get equity, whether they should have to pay out money in the form of dividends, whether they can raise money in the form of bonds. All of these decisions are made by financial institutions. And that reflects the central role that financial markets have in a market economy. The market economy is about efficient resource allocation, and the financial industry is the industry that determines where capital is allocated, to which companies and which activities. So how can we think about climate change in this context? We know that we will need to make a transition from a carbon-based to a low-carbon energy system. That transition will have to happen over the coming few decades, and sooner rather than later. We know that this transformation will not just affect a few sectors, but it will affect very many sectors, and every sector that is related to energy markets in some form, either as producers or consumers of energy. So we know that this transformation will have to happen. What we don't know is the extent to which this transformation will happen through a transformation of existing companies, or by the gradual building down of existing companies and building up of new companies. Will the energy companies of the future be today's fossil fuel companies who have managed to transform themselves into renewable energy companies? Or will they be new players taking their place? Will the automobile producers of the future be today's automobile producers who have managed to transform themselves into producers of electric cars? Or will there be new players like Tesla and others who dominate that market in the future? I think the honest and most probable answer is it'll be a mix of both. Some companies will be able to transform themselves. Other companies will not be able to transform themselves. The challenge for the investor community is to determine which companies will be able to make that transition and which will not be able to make that transition. And the implication for you as an investor is that if you believe that a company will be able to transform itself, you will be happy to let that company reinvest the money that they're making now in their own business. But if you don't believe that this company will be able to survive and make money in a low-carbon economy, then you should look to get money out of this company in the form of dividends now and reinvest in some other business that you think is better aligned with or better suited to a low-carbon future. So an important insight is that by doing this in a good way, investors are protecting the value of their own portfolios because they are investing in the right companies, but they are also providing a very useful service to society. Because if they manage to pick the right companies, it means that the right companies will get financing. The companies that will be able to make the transition will get financing. The companies that will not be able to make the transition will not get financing. And that money, that capital, will over time be made available to new businesses that can be a part of this energy transition. So if the financial industry does this in a good way, they are helping themselves, but they are also helping society, because we will have a speedier and smoother transition to a low-carbon economy. So this, in many ways, was the starting point of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, which the minister also referred to in his opening remarks. I was, or am, we're still working, privileged to be a member of this task force. And when we set out to develop this reporting framework, we asked ourselves the question, what kind of information would an investor need to make this kind of judgment? So this reporting standard focuses on the viability or the robustness of business models. Now, there are many questions, and you will have seen the framework. There are several questions in the framework, but there are two of them that to me are very central. One is the very first question, which asks companies to describe how the board oversees climate-related risks and opportunities. It's a very simple question, but a very powerful question. If the board of a company does not consider climate change or climate risks, it is highly unlikely that a company will be able to make a massive transition into a low-carbon economy. If the board actively considers this, it's at least possible. It's not guaranteed, but it's at least possible. The second question we ask, which I think is really crucial and which is probably the single question that has attracted most attention, is a question about the robustness or resilience of companies' business strategies, taking into account various climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. So what does this mean in plain language? It means, please tell me how your company will continue to make money if we're successful in climate policies. If we're successful in implementing the Paris Agreement, if we're successful in limiting to 2 degrees or below, how will your company still make money? This is a very simple question to ask, but a very difficult question to answer for many companies. So I think we're at the start of a long journey where we're trying to ask these questions of companies. And we're asking these companies because investors need to understand whether they believe that a specific company is ready for this transition. Does the company have a good story to tell about this transition to a low-carbon economy? And does this company deserve more funding from financial markets? At the heart of this, of course, is the dialogue between investors and corporates. The reporting is meant to be an element in that dialogue. So this, of course, relates to a wider issue of the relationship between companies and their investors, which, of course, in Japan has been addressed through the stewardship codes and the corporate governance codes. So reforming corporate governance is positive also in the sense that it provides a better platform for this interaction between investors and companies on climate change as it does in other areas. And good corporate governance practices are required for this dialogue to have any meaning and content. Finally, just a couple of words on the role of the PRI in all of this. So I think there are three main things that we should be doing. Number one, interacting with policymakers, because a reporting framework needs the recognition and support of the regulators and authorities in different countries. I'm very encouraged by the minister's clear support for this framework, as we have heard support from leading political figures also in other countries. This is number one. Number two is investors need to engage with companies on reporting. Investors need to engage with companies and ask for these reports. And the PRI is facilitating dialogue between investors and large companies on these issues. Investors are now starting to ask for reports based on this format. But number 3 is we need to strengthen the capacity of investors to understand the reports that they get. Reporting does not help if no one reads the reports. It doesn't help if no one has the capacity to understand what they say and build that into their investment decisions. So investors also need to cooperate on how they can use these reports and how they can implement this into their investment strategies. So this is work that's going on internationally. I think the global trends are clearly in favor of more reporting, but also more attention to climate risk. I'm very happy to see that trend reflected also here in Japan. We're grateful for all the work that the PRI signatories in Japan have done, which has been extraordinary. It's a very active network of investors. We're always, of course, also grateful for any new investors who like to join our network, and we think climate change is an area where we certainly can provide some value to our signatories. So these international trends that are very strong are also reflected in the Japanese market. So with that, I thank you very much again for your kind invitation and for your attention, and I'm looking forward to an interesting seminar. Thank you.